And our dean is going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker. So take it away.
Hi, everyone. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm so happy to see you. Welcome back for our fourth day of programming. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Can everyone online hear? I'm hoping that Dr. Steffen can actually hear his own introduction. Do we have any thumbs up on there?
I can hear.
Great, thank you. There he is. Great. Today, our presenter is an associate professor of physics. He is a former member of the science team for NASA's Kepler mission. I'm going to come back to that. He studies exoplanets, so I hope I get this right, exoplanets and exoplanetary systems, systems of planets that orbit around distant stars. Is that correct, Dr. Steffen?
Yep, that's right. Okay.
And he has been cited over 23,000 times. So if you look up his impact factor online, that number is quite audacious. It's quite robust. And here is the last thing that I will say, is that his book, Hidden in the Heavens, How the Kepler Mission's Quest for New Planets Changed How We View Our Own, will be coming out, I think, in October. And that book can be pre-ordered on Amazon. So I'm hoping that you go to Amazon and pre-order that book because we should all read it. He is an unbelievably impactful scholar in the discipline, and UNLV is so lucky to have him here. And we are absolutely thrilled that he's here to sort of introduce you as you're onboarding to graduate school to the scientific writing process. Really, he's a treasure for us, and so it's our pleasure to welcome him. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Steffen for today's workshop.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate it. So is the sound right? I can't tell if I'm sharing the screen properly or not.
You're good.
Okay. All right. So you'll have to I apologize for my flush face. I'm at a NASA facility and I'm inside one of these little cubes, and there's no air. So it's getting warm and humid while I'm in here. Okay, so talking about scientific writing. So I'm going to give you my take on it, and you can take this advice and or not as you see fit. But I have a fair amount of experience correcting the mistakes that either I've made or other people have made in our writing. And so this comes from all the mistakes that I've made and that you can hopefully learn from without having to repeat them yourself. So I'll start with basically just some initial thoughts on scientific writing, and then give you some tips on how to structure what your writing looks like. In this case, it's mostly for academic papers, and then some tips on the prose that you use, like what kind of words to use in your descriptions, and then just a little bit on writing in general at the end. Let's see. So the first most important thing for you when you're writing something is to know who it is that your audience, like who are you speaking to when you write your paper? Are you speaking to people who already know what you're talking about? Are you speaking to people who have no idea what you're talking about? Are you speaking to people who, you know, are just enthusiastic amateurs who probably know more details about the subject than you do because as a professional, you get kind of narrow, kind of sometimes have a narrow perspective on things. So knowing who your audience is, who you're speaking to is really important. And then also knowing what it is that you're trying to say is really important. Because if you don't know what your message is, then you're basically wasting people's time because why are they having to figure out what it is that you're trying to say? All right, so one of the most important things is to control the scope of your paper. So when knowing what your message is means knowing what your paper is supposed to deliver and to have your text, like everything that you write focused on delivering that message. So in general, I tell people that if you're writing like one paper for one message, if you try to have too many messages or like too many points that you're trying to make in a single paper, then some of your points are going to get lost. You may end up like diffusing the impact that your paper could have by trying to do too many things at once. So this requires sometimes a lot of self-control. So self-control is essential for preventing the scope to creep. Like you start off with, we're going to answer this question, and then, oh, now we're going to answer this question and this question. Oh, and look, here's something else that's interesting. And if I turn the data upside down and I look at it this way, then maybe that's interesting. And so at some point, the tangential stuff that you find as you're writing your scientific papers might be worth having their own, like spinning it off and having its own paper instead of kind of cluttering the one that you have. I personally despise refereeing papers that are too long. So the longest paper that I've ever personally authored was about twice as long as it should have been, because I should have split it in half. I prefer short papers that people will actually read instead of long ones that people will cite but not actually read. Let's see, here's my pointer. So here's an example, choosing the message. So I wrote this paper, the period ratio distribution of Kepler's candidate multi-planet systems, back in the day. It's 17 pages, this is the one I was talking about that's a little bit too long. It has 76 citations, which in my discipline is not too bad, especially because it's kind of a narrow focus. So that's not bad to have 76 citations. And it had two primary ideas in it. One of them is the one on the left, which is the period ratio distribution of the Kepler multi-planet systems. And this is important because it gives us the history of the planetary systems, and we can compare to the solar system and things like that. And almost everybody in my discipline knows this result. So this is well known. What's not well known is the second half of the paper, which is this result, which shows the proximity to mean motion resonance for planet pairs, depending upon if they're adjacent planet pairs or non-adjacent planet pairs. Almost nobody knows that this result exists, even though I've probably spent more time trying to figure out how to make this plot than any of the other plots in the paper. And so by not dividing this paper into two, this whole thing might as well not even exist in the literature because nobody knows about it. I mean, there's like 3 people that know about it, and that's because I told them. So along those same lines, if something interesting comes along while you're writing a paper, you don't want to ignore it. So if you're working on something and you see something unusual in the data, or you have an idea as you're putting your text down, don't ignore those interesting results because they might prove to be important. So on the left, this is a paper that I wrote back in the day. It shows the period ratio, like a histogram of the period ratio, depending on the number of planets that are in the system. And I noticed that there was this box down here in the left that shows up in the outline histogram, but not in the solid histogram. So there's this gap that opens up here. And at the time I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. I wonder what's going on. I published this paper, and then it inspired a second follow-up paper to explore this more carefully. And actually this follow-up paper ended up being more highly cited than the original one. And so it was something that we noticed in the data. We weren't prepared really to investigate it within this particular, well, when I say we, I guess I mean I wasn't prepared to investigate it further in this particular paper. And so it spawned a subsequent study that has gotten a decent amount of attention that came from just seeing this anomaly and then trying to figure out what was going on with that anomaly. So you don't want to ignore interesting results. So this was a success story where there was an interesting result, and it ended up becoming its own paper that was also interesting. Here's a failure story. So this is a paper that I wrote right at the time that I was coming here, which is about 10 years ago. I tried for a while. I noticed that here's this 2-dimensional histogram, and I noticed that there was these 2 peaks in the histogram. So it's almost like there were like a bimodal structure, that there's a peak here and then a little valley and then another peak here. And I tried for about a week to measure the statistical significance of this, probably even longer than a week. So I tried to tease out what was going on here, and I just kind of gave up after a while. I remember I even had a paragraph in the text, and then I removed that paragraph. Well, about a year later, maybe 18 months later, a group of friends of mine, so I guess it's only a slightly sad story, but a group of friends of mine published this paper that shows this same peak and then a valley and then a peak. So this picture here, this is a cross section going from the bottom end of this plot up to the top end of the plot. And they show this valley, and this paper has 900 citations. It's one of the most highly cited papers that exists in exoplanet science today. The only papers that get more citations than this are the ones where you conduct a large survey and then you publish the results of the survey. So it's my oversight when I was putting this paper together and I saw something interesting and I didn't follow up on it, could have been much more impactful than actually the original paper had I chosen to follow up on this result and looked at it in more detail. So fortunately for the field, the other groups didn't waste their time when they saw something interesting and they followed up with it. So don't ignore interesting results when they come out. Sometimes when you're working on something, when you see something interesting, it might even completely change your the structure, what you're planning to write about. If you see something really interesting, you may completely rewrite the paper that you're working on in order to highlight that interesting result. So here's, I guess, so I'll come back to that in a moment. One thing to remember is that a research article is not a memoir. So most people don't care about like what order you did things in, because the order that you do the research is not necessarily the best order to present the results of the research. You want to present the results of the research in a way that's really clear about what it is that you're trying to accomplish, what it is that you learned, how you did it, which is not necessarily I went down this dead end and then I went down another dead end and then I came back and then I decided that I needed to change something and then do this other thing. That's getting in the way. Your history is getting in the way of your message. Your message should be, here's this experiment, or here's this theory that we did, and here's the result, and here's how we, came up with our analysis method or whatever. It's not a memoir. And so there may be things that you spend a lot of time on that never actually make it into the literature. So the historical timeline is probably the least important aspect of your paper, or among the least important aspects. I'm sure I can come up with something else, but like what you ate for dinner is also less important. But the historical timeline, if it gets in the way of delivering what it is you want to deliver, then trash it, put it to the side, focus on your message and your audience. So this is an example of a paper. So this is a survival of non-coplanar closely packed planetary systems. And we were about ready to submit. We'd been working on it for 4 years. David Rice was an undergraduate student at the time. He now finished his PhD with me and is now a postdoc in Israel. So we were about to ready to submit this paper after 4 years of work. And then David made this plot that showed so here's this stuff, here's this collection of points, and then it all of a sudden turns over and you get this second behavior. So nothing, 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 and then a big signal. And as soon as he made this plot, he actually made the blue points first. As soon as he made that plot, it was like, that's it. That's the result that we want to show. And so we completely rewrote the paper in order to showcase and highlight this result. Even though we were right at the end of doing everything, this was by far the most interesting result and explaining what was going on. And so we rewrote the paper. It took us, I don't know, like 6 months or so, but the paper is far better now that we know that we spent the time to understand the data, to find this figure, and then to be able to explain the figure. So even though we had spent a lot of time on everything else, when you see the right result, that's the one that you want to publish, because that's what it's going to be remembered for. So in general, when you're writing a paper, my papers that I work on with my group, they're almost all the same order. So it's abstract, introduction, data and methods, like where you're getting your data from and how you're analyzing the data, and then what are the results of that analysis, and what are the corollaries, or what are the things that follow from the results of your analysis. And then there's a discussion section where I try to piece, how do my results and my interpretation of those results fit into the broader context of everything? How does it fit into discussions about planetary systems that orbit this type of star, or planetary systems that have this many planets in them? So the discussion is where I place my results into the context of the rest of the literature. It's also a place where I'll take time to point out the shortcomings of it, where we'll say, we use this approximation, and so there's still work to be done to relax that approximation and instead do something more general. So the discussion is where I point out kind of how everything, like why the result is important, like where it fits into things, and also point out the stuff that I left behind that might be work for either my group to work on or for somebody else's work group to work on to follow up on whatever it was that we did. And then the conclusion is really just an opportunity to take the introduction and the results and give a short, concise, I guess short and concise mean the same thing, but an outline of here are if you only remember a few things, these are the things you should remember from this paper. And so that's what I put in the conclusion section. And the appendix, if there is one, is everything that gets in the way of telling, if it's a tangent that only 5 people in the world are going to care about, that goes in the appendix. So that could be some details of a particular calculation, or, if we're calibrating an instrument and we had to do it in a special way, that might go into the appendix. So this is the order that the sections appear in the papers themselves, but that's not necessarily the order that I write them. I usually will write them. Okay. So I guess I have all this stuff. So what's in the paper is in the abstract. What is the gap in the knowledge? So the introduction is what is the gap in the knowledge? So the point of the introduction is to show your audience that there's a hole and that hole needs to be filled. And so it's telling the audience why they should read your paper in the first place. Then what did you do? What did you find out? What are the implications of what you did? And then if you only remember a few things, remember these things, and then, bring stuff. So the order that I usually write my paper is the data and methods first. So I write this, I write the results in the analysis, I write the discussion, and then I write the introduction, because nobody really likes to write the introduction because that means that you have to read the literature that already exists. So I write the introduction at that point, because by then, now this is like, people might be different. Some people might write the introduction first and then do this. It's all up to you as the writer, what order you want to do it in. But I start with the most interesting stuff for me, and then I end with the most boring stuff for me, with the exception of the conclusion, because a lot of times people overlook like the point of like, why do we have each of these sections? The conclusion is not something to overlook. One thing to just keep in mind, even when you're giving a presentation, the presentation, a lot of times, this happens so often, and don't let it happen to you. They will spend too much time on introductory material, because if you're at a scientific conference, everybody already knows the introductory material. So don't spend too much time on the introductory material. Don't spend too much time on the stuff up here. What happens is, often when you go to scientific conferences, is people run out of time because they're flapping their lips doing all this stuff, and they miss the conclusion. They just put the conclusion slides up on there and then take questions. So you don't have enough time to read their conclusion slide before people start asking questions, and they haven't gone through their conclusions either. And so it's like, why did I listen to all this stuff? And so you want to make sure that you save, when you're giving a presentation, save time to actually go through the conclusions, because that's what people are going to remember. And so the same thing goes with your writing. After, it's entirely conceivable. In fact, this is what happens. I'll neither confirm nor deny that this is how I read papers. If I need to find out what's in a paper, I go to the conclusion section. And so your paper is a reference. It's not a story. And so you want people to be able to go to the sections and get the information that they want out of those sections. If they only want to know, what are the main points of this, because maybe I need to read this paper, maybe I don't, and I'm not sure, I'm going to go to the conclusion section to see if it actually applies to what it is that I'm working on. So it's important to have the conclusion be clear as to what it is that you discovered in your investigation. And then the abstract I usually write at the very end, because then I've synthesized everything, right? This is a short synopsis of everything that's in the paper. And then the appendix, if to the extent that there might be one, you just put it in as you go. It's like, this is getting kind of boring, so maybe it should go in the appendix, and then we'll just refer people to it. Okay. So about the prose, like when you're actually doing your writing, the paragraph is the fundamental unit of your paper. Each paragraph is one idea that you need to convey. And so that's the way that you should think about it. I'm going to write a paragraph that does, if I have a section that's about the data analysis, what are the things that the people need to know? Each paragraph is going to be one element of that. It's not the sentence. The sentence is too small of an object. A paragraph is a way of conveying an idea, and you have some number of sentences in order to convey the idea. So you want to think of the paragraph as the thought that you're getting across, and then you tack onto it the next thought, and then the next thought. So that's your fundamental unit to work with. It's impossible, unless it's impossible to do this, if for some reason the paragraph seems to drag on. You want to keep your paragraph short and focused on one point, and not turn it into a kind of a laundry list of things. You can't always do this, but that's what you should always look for, is a short paragraphs that are focused. It makes it hard to read if your paragraph is one whole column of a paper, because you don't know, well, okay, maybe people are more patient than I am, but if I see something that's a whole column of paper, like, I don't know when I'm supposed to start and stop thinking about the ideas that are being presented there. So you want to, when you're writing, you want to provide the motivation for the paragraph up front. Why should the reader spend his or her time reading your stupid paragraph? If you don't provide the reason for it up front, then they may lose interest as they're going through the paragraph, and then the important stuff at the end is lost because they stop paying attention, as they're just like, the words are just going by. You want to have the reason for the paragraph to go up the front. So it goes back, your paper, not only is it not a memoir, but it's not a murder mystery. And so you want to front load the paragraph with the important things, so that if someone's reading it, they can read the first part, and then they'll know if it's worth it. Like, do I need to read the rest, or is that all details that are not important? So your paper is not a murder mystery. You don't need to make it like a novel trying to figure out, like, have the reader try to figure out what's going on. Just put the information up front where it's most important. Some historical missteps can be useful in the literature. Like, if you make a mistake and you want to make sure that people don't make the same mistake, it's okay to do that, but think about the best place to put them. It's more important to be clear than to put them in order. And I'll give some examples about this, I think now. Yeah, okay. So here is an example of a paragraph. This was stolen from somebody, then I rewrote everything. So it says, we selected stars from Groovy Catalog using funky criteria. We refined our sample with tubular methods. Then we analyzed the sample with cool math. Because of esoteric physics, this approach didn't work. So we tried radical criteria and did a hipster analysis. That didn't work either. So we finally selected a sample from gnarly catalog using bodacious criteria. A Mondo analysis of that sample is shown in figure 2. All of this stuff is out of order. This is like, we made this mistake, we made this mistake, we made this mistake. And then the reader's like, why should I keep reading? This is all the mistakes that they made. The important thing is right here. We finally, like, this was our sample, this is what we did, and this was our analysis, and it's shown here. So I think I have it rewritten. We selected a sample from stars, a sample of stars from gnarly catalog using bodacious criteria. A Mondo analysis of that sample is shown in figure 2. Next paragraph. Originally, now we can go into the historical stuff about why, so that other people don't waste their time doing the first part. Originally, we analyzed stars from groovy catalogs using fun criteria and refined with tubular methods. Because of esoteric physics, a cool math analysis of the sample didn't work. A radical criteria sample with a hipster analysis also failed for uncool reasons. And now they get the information that's most important right here. And if they care about the history, they can read this. Otherwise, they can skip it and go to something else. Where if you put it in this form with, like, oh, I want to share you the story of my pain as I did all of these different things. Look how, look how challenging my life is as a scientist. Some fraction of your audience is going to stop reading, and they're going to miss the whole point to the paragraph, which was to introduce this figure. Okay, another one. Unless otherwise indicated, use first person. There are some disciplines where they don't encourage the use of first person, and all those disciplines are wrong. You should use first person as much as possible. One of the reasons that I have, there's a question about whether you should use I or we. One of the reasons that I always bring on a co-author, there are 2 reasons that I bring on co-authors. One is so that they can write the introductory material that I don't want to write. And 2 is so that I can use we and I don't have to think about this question. But using first person, and I'll show you the reason why you want to use first person, aside from the fact that it's way, way easier to read. Active voice. So not everything was, mistakes were made, that kind of stuff. You want to use active voice. You want to use verbs that actually mean something, and not, maybe your first draft is going to have a bunch of passive voice because you're just getting your ideas down. But as you do your revisions, switch to active voice when possible, which is most of the time. And then it's important to have a consistent tense throughout your paper. This different people have different philosophies about what tense to use. For me, I generally use present tense when I'm doing my paper for the results that are central to the paper. And that way it frees up the use of past tense for example, if I needed to do some type of calibration of my instrument, or I needed to do something and it's an aside from the rest of the prose. So I'll be going through the prose and I'll be like, okay, here's the thing where I need to take an aside and then explain something. Then I can switch to past tense and go back to present tense. And even if the reader doesn't notice it explicitly, it will make the content flow more consistently. And it won't confuse like what's the main narrative from something else. It helps separate the main narrative from tangents. So you want to use a consistent tense. Some people just use past tense all the time. I don't. If it's related to the paper that they're currently reading, then I usually use present tense. I recommend that people use caveman grammar. So that means you have a subject and a verb and an object. I read book. And then all the parent, like, what are they called? Prepositional phrases and all that stuff, and all the descriptive stuff can go after the main parts of the sentence. So subject, verb, object, and then other stuff. This is way easier to read than to have a clause at the beginning that really doesn't apply until, why make your sentences harder to read? If what you're doing is important, it's going to be hard enough, it's going to be technical enough that you don't need to make it more complicated by having a unique sentence structure. And if your sentences are getting too long, then cut it down and make it 2 sentences. And then when you're done, or even while you're writing, get rid of all your adverbs, because adverbs are for losers. They rarely have anything useful to add to the paper, and that because they usually lack a technical meaning. And I'll give you an example here in a moment. In general, follow these rules first. After you follow the rules, then you'll know when you can break them, right? When you're going to pass your driver's test, you need to stop at the stop sign. After you stop at the stop sign multiple times, then you'll know under what circumstances you can, well, you should always stop at a stop sign, but you'll know when you can break the rules. Follow the rules first. If you don't follow the rules first, then you don't know, then you're not wise enough to know when to break them. Okay, so here's an example. Using a Brown 2000 oscilloscope, the voltage was measured with very high precision. This sounds like the kind of sentence that you would read in the scientific literature, which is why it's such a boring sentence. Okay, using a Brown 2000 oscilloscope, the voltage was measured with very high precision. So this breaks all the rules that I just said. It's got the least important information up front. Okay, the Brown 2000 oscilloscope is not, it's only going to be the experimentalists that are working in your discipline that care what your oscilloscope was. Most of the readers are not going to care what oscilloscope you use to measure it. So it's the least important information is the first stuff that your audience is reading. It's in the third person, the voltage, as opposed to some living, breathing person. It's in passive voice. The voltage was measured, like magically the voltage was measured. And it was measured with very high precision, which has no meaning, because what does it mean to be very, very highly precise? In quantum electrodynamics, very high precision would be 15 decimal places. In gravitational theory, very high precision would be like 10%. And so, or, in exoplanet theory, it would be like 10%. So like these don't mean anything in the paper unless you've already assigned a technical definition to them. So I'm going to rewrite this sentence. Actually, I've already rewritten it. I'm going to show you a rewriting of this sentence that is much, much better, because it is. So we don't know. So in this case, we don't know who measured the voltage. We don't know what high precision means. And are we sure that it's very high precision as opposed to just regular high precision? So instead, this sentence, if I were to come across this, first of all, I would pull my graduate student aside and say, okay, don't let this happen again. It should be written this way. We measured the voltage to 4 significant figures using a Brown 2000 oscilloscope. We measured the voltage, so we are responsible for the voltage that was measured. We did it. So it's first person, active voice, and 4 significant figures actually means something. Like this, then the reader can say, oh, that's actually really good. That's 0.1%, or like 10, what is it, 100 parts per million, something like that, 10 parts per million. So that's, this is highly significant, or maybe it isn't, like it's good enough for whatever. So this way, the reader who's an expert in the field and they can understand whether this is very high precision or regular high precision, or they don't even need to use this because they just have the number right in front of them. And then the last thing they care about, and all 2 people in the world who care that you use the Brown 2000 oscilloscope will be able to do that. So let's see, yeah, so that's an example of taking this common style of sentence that you get in the scientific literature and making it at least less uninteresting to read. Okay, so here's another one. So this was taken from one of my former graduate students who shall remain nameless. This result can be used to inform observers of the optimum time to observe a system in order to diminish the ambiguity of RV models near the 2-to-1 degeneracy. Data gathered near these key phases will have more weight than determining the correct architecture in any other phase. Coordinated observations at specific times should reduce the operation time and therefore costs required to determine the architecture of planetary systems near the 2-to-1 degeneracy. So I'm sure that was wonderful to hear. Here's how I would recommend rewriting this. Our results identify the times when new observation will best distinguish between competing RV models for planets near the 2-to-1 degeneracy. No second paragraph. Observing at optimal times reduces both the operational costs and time required to correctly infer the orbital properties of planets in relevant systems. So, okay, so it's still not the most engaging prose, but it's much more concise, and like this result can be used to inform observers. Our results identify the times. Okay, like can be used to inform the observers of the optimum time. This whole thing can be used to observe or to inform observers of the optimum time to observe. How many words is that? That's like 10 words is now our results identify the times, down to 5. Okay, so switching to the first person active voice, no adverbs, just think of all the trees you're saving by not having all this extra text in the paper. And it's more interesting. Our results identify. It's okay, so it's not first person, but it's results identify. Results identify times, subject, verb, object. And then all this stuff is details. Observing at optimal times, so that's a fairly large subject, reduces. So observing reduces both this and this. Okay, let's see, what else do I have in here? You can't edit. So when it comes to actually writing your paper, getting the prose on the page, you can't edit an empty page. So to some extent, it's best to get words on the paper first, and then you can edit it. The same thing happens. So if you're taking a math class, you can't correct an empty page. And so I've worked with students where like they're so afraid of making mistakes that they don't write anything down. And so like we don't even know what the mistakes are going to look like yet because there's nothing to correct. So just start writing prose on the page. You can go back and fix it once it's down on the page. Okay, so I have a picture of the Spanish steps here, and I don't remember why. And so maybe I'll skip it. But I guess if you want to make it up to the top, then you take little steps to work your way up. Okay, when the going gets tough. So this is my advice to writing. When the going gets tough, set smaller goals. So a lot of times, I'm sure we've all fallen into this situation where I'm not going to work on this today, and I'll just spend a lot of time on it tomorrow. Okay, I'm not going to work on it today either, apparently, because I found something else to use to procrastinate. And so I'll just spend time on the weekend. And then, of course, the weekend comes, it's like, that's actually kind of nice weather outside. And so maybe I'll just do it. Okay, Sunday afternoon, I'll definitely sit down for sure this time. And I will do all of the work from the whole previous week, and I'll definitely do that. And then it's like, wow, that's a lot of stuff that I got to do in the next 2 hours, and I don't really want to do it. So look, the Olympics are on. How about that? And so my advice to people like my graduate students and everything is if they're bogged down on the writing side, to set smaller goals. I'm going to write 1 paragraph before I go to lunch, a whole paragraph with at least 3 sentences in it. And so I'm not going to get up from this chair until I've written 3 paragraphs, or I'm sorry, 1 paragraph with 3 sentences. And then the sentences can be even short. They don't even have to be long. You just like, as long as you get the paragraph down. And so this is like when I was writing my book, that's coming out in October. That was basically the thing that I had to adopt is, I don't really know this stuff very well. I'm not going to be able to get my word limit in or like my word quota in. And so I'm going to cut my quota down. so that for the next little while, I'm going to dial back. So I set a goal for myself to write 500 words a day. So 500 words a day, it's about a page in a single day. That was my writing goal. If I found that if I wrote 1,000 words, then I wasn't as prepared the next day to come up with more stuff. So that was just my style and probably the subject matter. And so 500 words a day was all I could do. And when things got tough, for one reason or another, and I wasn't making much progress, I dialed it back. I got down to the point where I was like, okay, if I just get 100 words in, then I'll feel good about myself. And then you get through the tough section because it's not what you're really interested in or whatever. And then I ramped it back up. Okay, now we're getting close to the end. I really like this stuff again. And so when the going gets tough, don't make yourself into a hero. Set smaller goals and you'll eventually get through it. But if you're like, I'm just going to sit down and I'm going to stare at this computer screen, I'm not going to move a muscle except for my fingertips until I finish this whole section, it's not going to work. So when you're doing your dissertation or something like that, the fastest way to get through it is to make consistent progress. And the ancients have known this too. Oftentimes shorter articles will take longer to write because you have to cut things down. So my favorite scientific journal, although they've gone the wrong way a little bit lately, they've started allowing longer papers into the journal. My favorite journal was called the Physical Review Letters, and it had a 4-page limit, and that included all the references. So you had to fit everything into 4 pages, no exceptions. And so that forced you to actually write good prose. It forced you to cut out all the stuff that wasn't necessary. And one of the things I'm highlighting here, so we measured the amplitude, and this was from, when did I do this paper? This was 2010. We measured the amplitude reflectivity of the surfaces averaged over all incident angles to be this number by placing samples into an integrating sphere illuminated with laser light. So notice we measured the amplitude. This circled text, that was about a week's of work, 1 week's worth of work in the laboratory to get one paragraph, or I'm sorry, one sentence in one paragraph. So even though, and it was one of the coolest things because it was like, wow, we set this up and wow, it worked. I didn't expect it to work quite as well as it did. But none of that story made it into the article because that's only for my personal journal that I told my diary on that evening. And what the main, like what everybody else needs to know is that we measured the reflectivity of it as a piece of stainless steel to be this number. So the audience doesn't care about my own personal gratification that came from it. So short articles take longer to write. It's also like I mentioned, this was a lot of work to get this one measurement, and it's one sentence, and it's we measured the amplitude. All right, let's see. So when you're writing, you want to always keep in mind, like, be charitable towards your audience. They don't want to read your stuff. So why should someone read a given paragraph? They have the opportunity. They could be on Twitter fixing all the world's problems, and instead they're reading your paper. And so you want to tell them why they should be reading. Like, you want the information to motivate them to read to the end of the paragraph, to read the rest of the sentence, to read the rest of the section or whatever. And so you want to front load your stuff, like the information up front. It also makes it easier to know what to cut out because the most important stuff is at the front of your of each little portion, at the front of the paragraph, at the front of the section, at the front of the sentence. So this is a second order piece of advice that, as you write more prose, you'll be able to identify stuff like this. So sometimes you can switch between the subjects to smooth out the prose. So for example, we did analysis, we see trend from analysis, we show result from trend. That's a reasonable, like, this follows the rules that I said. We did this, we saw this, we show this. Okay, but it also reads a little bit like the see Dick run, see Jane run, see Spot climb. And so maybe you want to go a little bit more sophisticated than that, but you still want to have it easy to read. So then you can change it from we did analysis, and then this is your object, and now it's your subject. Analysis shows trend, and then now that's the object that becomes the subject. Trend implies result. So we did this analysis, the analysis shows this result, shows this trend implies this result. And so it's a little bit smoother in terms of like how it kind of rolls off the tongue, or how, at least for me, how I read it. it's a little bit more cohesive. Like the sentences glue together a little bit better. It's less jumpy. Of course, I have this visual aid so that I can claim that I'm right. But that's basically something to think about in terms of when you're going through your drafts and you're trying to rub off the rough edges and make everything a little bit more smooth. This is one kind of trick that you can do to do that. Let's see. See what else I've got. I think that's what I've got. I'm happy to. Hopefully that was interesting and worth your time. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
I have one. So, just like an estimated like average, how many pages are usually like dissertations?
So that depends on the field. The really cool fields, it's about 100 pages. The fields that are less cool, it's usually more than that. So my dissertation was, I think like 106 pages. But I know that like a friend of mine did her PhD in psychology and it was like 3 volumes. I suspect that most of that probably, well, I don't know. So you probably need to look at other dissertations from within your discipline to see like how long they're supposed to be. So for my students, a typical dissertation is like 3 academic papers, like 3 scientific papers, and then they staple them together. And so I think most of them are, I think David's was 200, like 180 pages or something like that. So but in physics, they might be a little bit shorter, and in other disciplines, they might be longer. So that's the best I can tell you, I think. But shorter is always better.
I can just jump in and give you a follow-up. A lot of units also have essentially the standard is to do kind of a 3-paper dissertation. So my dissertation, I got my degree in the UC system in California, was 3 articles. And then we essentially threaded those together. And some institutions actually have what they refer to as a staple dissertation in STEM, which is literally 3 papers, and you can staple it and turn it into the grad college and your degree gets conferred. UNLV does not yet have that, although I'm working on it really hard. But there's some institutional inertia, we'll call it, in order to do that. But I am urging units to move more in that direction, especially for the STEM and STEM related fields, to be kind of more in line with what other R1s are doing, which then also absolutely underscores what Dr. Steffen just said. The shorter the better in many of these instances. And so we often think that a really long and huge bulky dissertation implies significance and importance, when in actuality, what really has the most impact in a discipline is stuff that's going to be easily digested and well cited. And the impact of that is also sort of where you publish it. So I think that was just an amazing introduction. And because you're just starting out, I don't know if you know how truly magical that was, but I'm going to write to him privately and thank him for that overview. But just try to absorb as much as you can from what was just shared with you, because I think it's really unbelievably valuable.
Go for it.
So, first of all, thank you, doctor, for your speech. Was really insightful. So, considering the peer review process, how much of or which parts of this structure that you showed us would you leave up to the reviewers? If you would have some advice on, so your paper is considered, very concise and is ready to go, but you will follow through this process of peer review, and you have some hints and tips and even, critics. So you have a special, section that you would consider. So we may leave it up to the reviewers and see how it goes.
So let me make sure I understand the question. Is the question, how much do I let the reviewers influence my writing process?
Yeah, or if you have a section that you are more into the getting some perspective from the reviewers than others, perhaps the results or the conclusion.
The other side to the peer review process.
Yeah.
So the peer review process, generally speaking, the reviewer is supposed to review the paper that they're presented with. And so if I wanted to include something, I would include it. And if I don't want to include something, I don't include it. The exception to that is if the reviewer points out maybe a flaw or a way of improving something, then in response to the referee, I will maybe add a section, or will rewrite a section, or will, change an analysis. It usually would correspond to either rewriting a section or a portion, or adding a new section that discusses specifically what the reviewer says, or it will be, I will respond with, I'm not going to do that. Thank you for the idea, but that's going to be like, here's the reason. Now, I'm not really that gruff. I mean, okay, so in my mind, I'll be like, I'm not going to do that. But when I respond to the referee, I'll say, oh, we won't be pursuing this particular analysis because of, and I'll give the reasons why we don't do it. So I respond in good faith. You always want to respond in good faith. You don't know who the reviewer is. And a lot of times when people guess who the reviewer is, they guess wrong. I have lots of friends that are in the industry of who are journal editors, and they're like, yeah, the people always get it wrong. And so the reviewer, if they make a suggestion that fits within the scope of, and that goes back to the scope. If the reviewer makes a suggestion that fits within the scope, then I'll usually add it. But if the reviewer is making a suggestion that is outside of the scope of the paper, I may add it to the discussion, like a sentence that says, oh, this might have implications for this, or, in future work, this would be an analysis to be done. But I can't think of a time when I've ever kind of been pushed into doing something I didn't want to do by the reviewer. So, and that might be just because I'm lucky.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I have had that experience where the editor has said, you need to make these changes or we won't publish your paper.
Mm-hmm.
It's been very rare. Over the last 20 years, I would say that's been very, very rare.
Yeah.
Usually if you articulate your case and you can justify why you're making that decision to that excellent point just made, then.
I'm not sure if this was talked about, but what is the reasoning that some people might not want you to use first person? Like, why do some people want you to stay away from
Because they don't know any better.
that?
I think I have been on papers where one of the authors was like, I think sometimes people think it doesn't sound professional to say we measured something. And so they think that it sounds more, I guess, academic to say, mistakes were made and the voltage was measured with this thing, or it. So I think some of it is just people may, and it's got to be historical, because no one in their right mind would think that third person is more interesting to read than first person. Okay, and so I'm giving away my bias there. I think that historically, because I can think of circumstances when I was way back in the day when I was your age as a graduate student, there was an author who's like, yeah, we wrote this all in third person because that's kind of the academic style. And my graduate advisor at the time was like, no, don't do that. And so he protested and said, this needs to be rewritten in first person. And part of the reason was, he said that you need to have, his reasoning was, you need to know who to blame for the result. It's like, we measured this thing. We're the ones who are responsible for making the measurement. And so if the measurement is wrong, it's our fault. Or, David wrote this, and so it's his fault if the thing is wrong. But if so, I guess this is something for you when you run for political office. If you want to accept if you want to have the results be yours, like the positive results be yours, then you say, we solved this problem. And then if you want to deflect from the negative results of your stupid ideas, then you say, this problem occurred. And so for scientific writing, just in general, it's more clear what happened when you're using first person, who did it, or what it was done and how it was done. Where if you write in third person, especially third person passive voice, then you don't, there's a lot of nebulosity that goes along with it. It kind of clouds what really happened. So third person active voice, I mean, switching back and forth between first person active and third person active, that's like what I did at the end, where it's like the results show this, and then like the results show the trend, and the trend shows like implies this. So that's still active voice. The passive voice is really the thing that's the most difficult to visualize when it's happening, because you have to use your imagination as the reader to get what's going on.
You had a question?
Yeah, I do have a question. So what if you're writing a review though? Wouldn't that be in third person though? If you're
Okay, so if you're writing the review, so oftentimes, so I usually, and if I'm thinking about it, I'll say like the authors showed this. Like you use the authors as your subject for, like, if you're going to criticize them, like the authors did this analysis and here's where something is lacking. Um, I'll have to pull up some of my reviews to see, because I usually still write first person. Like I recommend that they do the following thing. The authors showed, or the authors did not clearly articulate the results of their analysis, or but even, because most of the people that I'm reviewing their papers, I know who they are. And I don't know. So I think even in reviews, I still write first person. And well, and I don't think as much about it in the reviews, because the audience is more narrow. So I guess I'd have to do an analysis of all my reviews and see how I do it. But like once you get in the habit, then it's hard to go back.
I can add on to that. So we have some clinical psych students in here. And so for those who are coming to us from neuro or from clinical psych, there may be instances where you will be writing in third person point of view. And that's because it's the disciplinary standard for certain types of papers, depending on the outlet, or depending, like if you're doing a big annual review where you're like, as an article, a big, huge, major review of all of the literature in the field, that would tend to be third person. So there's some disciplinary trends, but when the data are original data, it's an original research article that is coming out of your lab, I think that there is a trend also to move towards first person. So I'm really glad that you got to hear that perspective here, because I agree with that. But I think that for some of you and some of your kind of psych and psych adjacent disciplines, for those big, huge sweeping reviews, it will end up being third person because you're not reporting on your own lab's results. Right. Okay.
Yeah, but you could still you could still go to active voice when possible.
Absolutely. Better than passive. Passive is
Trash.
no good. Yeah. Adverbs are for losers, passive voice is for losers.
So present it in the present tense, not the past tense, but in third person if it's a review.
Keep your tense consistent for sure.
Yeah, as long as you're consistent, it doesn't really matter. I use present tense just because it gives you more flexibility for what you're doing in the future. Like as you're going through the article, there might be something that's like, oh, this is actually, if this was a textbook, it would be in its own box with a different color. Then you can just switch tenses, and then it kind of does that for you.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Steffen. That was excellent.
All right, thank you.